So I was about 10, and me, Grandma, and Papa were all out in the garden working. All throughout the day, we'd been having like severe thunderstorm watches and warnings. Every time a storm would come through, we'd get on the tractor, sit under the shelter, and then once it stopped raining, we'd go back out working the garden. We were picking corn that day, and I had 4 or 5 big ears of corn in my arms when Grandma said, "Come on, get on the tractor." So I threw the corn in that trailer we were pulling behind the tractor, and I jumped on the back of the tractor with her. My papa was driving the tractor. Between the tractor and pulling that trailer, it was so loud you couldn't hear anything at all. There was no point in trying to talk. All we could do was use like hand signals. So me and Grandma stepped down off the tractor onto the trailer and we walked towards the end of the trailer. So now there's a good few feet in between us and Papa. So I'm sitting on the end of the trailer and I look at Grandma. She's sitting across from me and she's looking out towards the field, and I see her facial expression change. And then she starts doing this, and I'm like, "What?" And then she runs up to the front of the tractor and starts trying to motion for Papa to stop. Of course, the tractor's so loud, he can't hear anything she's saying. She can't reach him because he's up there on the seat. She starts picking up ears of corn, throwing it at him, but she's missing. I walk up, and I'm like, "What are you doing?" And then she like yells in my ear, and I'm like, "What? I can't hear you." She grabs my head and turns it out that way, and I see a funnel cloud coming down, nearly touching the ground, but it hadn't made landfall yet. This was a big funnel cloud. I had never seen one that big or that close up before, so I was immediately scared. I start picking up ears of corn and slinging it, trying to hit him in the back of the head, and finally one lands, and he stops and turns around like, "What in the hell?" And he stops the tractor, but because of the sound, he still can't hear us. So Grandma starts pointing out towards the field, and he looks down and out, and he says, "Oh, a tornado, come on." We took off running. We jumped into a big ditch canal and sat there and waited. We all three sat there, squatted down in the ditch, watching this funnel cloud go up and down, up and down. You could tell it was trying to gain strength, and then finally it did. But there was one point where it came down right before it touched the ground, and it split apart, and it looked like 5 fingers that were all twisting at the same time while the whole thing was twisting. That tornado slung dead corn shucks that it was picking up off the ground, and it would just fly them up in the air and circulate and then just like throw them. And it would throw ears of corn, like the stalk that was left, just boom, and it was sticking to the dirt like a knife. And I was sitting there looking at this thing like, wow, what a monster. Something that you can't control, you can't stop. All you can do is hide from it, and it still might find you. And we just sit there and watch it until it finally dissipates.
So this guy says that he rented a room in a house with a whole bunch of other people. He doesn't know who it was or what it was, but there was definitely an entity that lived in that room as well. He said he wasn't scared because it never did anything to him, but it would drop a lot of his items in that room. He ends up talking to this entity out loud in his room, telling the entity that they can do whatever they want, but just don't drop things that can actually break. He felt that it was only fair because it's obvious that this entity lived there way before he even moved in. He said that this entity actually listened to him, that it would only drop things that couldn't break, like spoons, forks, like things of that nature. He says that he went as far as to ask this entity to wake him up at certain times so that he can get up and do his homework, and it would happen. He said that he would feel very cold hand. It would wake him up at the exact time that he asked. He would thank the entity and then start doing his homework. Due to the pandemic, he had to leave that house, but not before saying goodbye to his entity friend. So this girl says that she was in her bedroom on the computer when she heard her mom scream at her asking for a bar of soap. She goes to the closet where they keep all of the soaps. She said that at the time her mom used a very specific soap bar, so she didn't find it in that closet and screamed at her that she couldn't find it if she wanted another one. Her mom didn't respond, and because she didn't want to go all the way downstairs and then right back up, she ends up texting her mom, "Hey, the soap bar that you used is not here. Do you want a different one?" She knew that her mom would be on her phone because every time her mom took a shower, she took a little bit on the toilet on her phone. So she just thought her mom would definitely respond. Her mom ends up responding to her like, "What are you talking about?" And right after, she sends her a picture that she was outside of her brother's school. She then tells her, "Hey, I haven't been home. I left 20 minutes ago because I needed to come pick up your brother from school." She ends up going to the window to see if her mom's car is out there because she didn't believe her, and her mom's car was definitely not outside. She said that she got chills in that moment and ran out of that house because her grandma lived across the street. So she went over to grandma's house. There was nobody at her house, and she says that till this day she has no idea who screamed at her and why they were pretending to be her mom.
I think I made the stick people angry. This spooky scary story time comes from Cade, and he says that he has always been a very logical person. He has never believed in anything that he couldn't see with his own eyes until this experience. And he says that he believes he's being watched by stick people, and he had never heard of this before until a strange encounter with an old woman in the woods. And from what I gathered, stick people are often described as thin forest spirits that sometimes watch people from the trees, or other accounts say that they can enter homes without permission. They're described as being thin and tall, but they can also take the form of humans. Some lore even suggests that stick people are where the urban legend of Slender Man actually came from. Cade says that he is 32 years old and he has lived in Oregon for the last 17 years, and he often enjoys hiking in Mount Hood National Forest. And he had never experienced anything strange there before. He always just saw normal hikers or people jogging. But one evening late last year, he was hiking a less used trail, and he said it was approaching dusk. He realized that he should probably get back to his car. He had been out there for a while, and the forest had gotten really quiet. He couldn't even hear birds in the trees. As he was about to turn around, he noticed a woman standing about 20 feet just off the trail in front of him. And he said she was unnaturally pale. She was very short and petite. She had very long gray hair past her knees. She was wearing layers of old clothing, and she was not moving at all. But she was staring directly at him. So he decided that she may need help. And he approached her and he said, "Ma'am, are you lost? Do you need help getting somewhere?" She didn't take her eyes off of him, but she said, "You shouldn't be out here walking alone." And he said, "Oh, it's okay. I live right by here. I walk out here all the time." She stared at him a moment too long. He actually wondered if she had heard him at all. And he says, "Ma'am," and she says, "They're watching you." He said he didn't know what to make of that. He thought maybe she was having some kind of mental health crisis, and he assumed she meant maybe the animals. But she didn't say anything else. She just kept her eyes locked on him, and he said, "Who's watching me?" And she said, "The stick people," gesturing behind her to the woods. This is where he says he messed up and he thinks he accidentally angered her and possibly the stick people, because he says, "Oh, the stick people, what are they, Bigfoot's cousins?" He said as soon as he said this, the woman's face changed. She went from calm to furious, and she looked at him and she said, "You shouldn't mock them." Her voice was very harsh and he felt uncomfortable. So he said, "Okay, I'm sorry, ma'am. Do you need help getting somewhere?" And she said, "No, I'm fine. I'm at home." He said at this point he didn't want any more interaction with her. He turned around and said, "Okay, well, good luck out here." As he's walking away with his back toward her, he hears her call out behind him. They don't like being laughed at, and he turns around, but she's gone. Cade said at this point he wasn't worried about it, right? He said that Oregon is full of people with all kinds of different beliefs, and he just thought he encountered maybe somebody who was enjoying the woods a little bit too much, if you catch my drift. So he goes back to his car, he heads home, and nothing strange happens until a few nights later. It was a Saturday night. He had gone to bed early and he wakes up to a loud banging downstairs at about 2 o'clock in the morning. He said he heard footsteps. He said he heard some things sliding across the floor. He thought maybe they were moving furniture, and he assumed that someone broke in. He lived alone. It's a standalone house, so he has no upstairs or downstairs neighbors or anybody that could be making this noise. So he locks himself in the bathroom off his master bedroom and he calls 911. And the dispatcher asks him where he located, and he tells her, and she says, "Okay, stay there. I'm going to send somebody out." While he's waiting for police, he said he heard all kinds of shattering, like glass breaking, things being thrown. He was sure that whoever was down there was doing some damage, but police arrived shortly later and they cleared the house, and they said there was no signs of a break-in and nothing was broken and nothing was missing. Cade said he had no explanation for it because he was sure that he heard those things. It wasn't like he was dreaming. He was awake, he was on the phone, but there was nothing to be done. 2 weeks passed and nothing happened out of the ordinary, so Cade said he tried to put it out of his mind at this point. And it was around Christmas time, and he and his girlfriend drove to her parents' house about 2 hours away from where he lived. One of his neighbors was feeding and watering his cat. And one night about 7 p.m., as he's at his girlfriend's parents' house, his neighbor calls him and he thinks there's an issue with the cat, so he immediately picks up. And his neighbor says, "Hey, did you by chance come home early?" And Cade says, "No, I'm still here. Why?" His neighbor says, "Well, I was leaving your house and I was locking the door and I heard some footsteps upstairs and something moving." He said it sounded like furniture being moved, and there were definitely two voices talking up there. And he says, "Never mind, I'm going to call the police right now, but I'm just letting you know that this is going on. I think there's someone in your house." Cade says the police came out, they checked again, but there was no evidence that there was anybody who had forced an entry. No windows broken, the doors were locked, and there was nothing out of place. A month after that, Cade said he had worked late and was pulling into his house after dark. He was in his driveway and the fog was thick that night. The streetlights were eerie, but he happened to look up in his bedroom window and saw somebody peeking at him from behind the curtains. It was just for a split second, but for a moment he swore it was the woman he saw in the woods. She looked pale, she had the long gray hair. He blinked his eyes and she was gone. He said he was sure that there was someone in his house, so he called the police again, and the police came out, and this time they're sort of annoyed. They're like, "This is the third time we've come out to this house. We still can't find any evidence of someone breaking in. No windows are broken, your doors are locked." They actually ask him if he's been having any mental health issues, and he says no, but he actually wonders at this point if he's really making all of this up in his mind. His girlfriend knew all about the situation. She actually suggested that he check his attic to make sure that there was nobody squatting up there. He goes up there. There's no evidence that anyone's been living up there. He doesn't find anything. He has no basement, so it's not like there's somewhere in his house where somebody could hide. But it was really messing with his head. A few more weeks pass, nothing out of the ordinary. He's hoping it's all behind him. Shortly after that, he said he pulled into his driveway one night and he noticed it was another foggy night, not uncommon. But he says the fog wasn't moving naturally. It was shifting into these vertical shapes that almost seemed human like. It was just a really, really eerie night, so he ran inside and closed the door. But as he looked out the window, he swore he saw multiple figures peeking out at him from behind the trees. But at this point, he's like, okay, it's all in my head. It's just because of what this old woman told me. I have to go back there. He said his logic was if there was something supernatural going on, she would be out there and he would find her somehow. If she wasn't out there, he was going to put this out of his mind once and for all and refuse to even entertain the idea that somebody was watching him. The next day, even though it was cold out, he packs up, he takes the same less traveled trail back to the spot where he initially saw this woman, but she's not there, and he goes, I knew that she wouldn't be here. But as he turns, he notices something carved into the trees. There's 3 little stick figures, as if a child had drawn them, and that gave him chills in itself. But then he noticed there was another figure carved below them, but it wasn't a stick figure. It looked like a normal human, and below that was carved watched. He has had it, and he heads out and he's like, this old woman just puts things in people's minds. She just likes to creep people out. I'm out of here. I'm not going to entertain this. And he gets back to his car in the parking lot and he notices there's a squad car sitting in the parking lot, and the police officer rolls down his window and he's like, what are you doing out here? Blah, blah, blah. It's getting dark. Cade says that he just explained that he was out for a hike and that he was out there just looking for someone. And the police officer says, who are you looking for? And he says, oh, this is going to sound crazy, but there's this old woman out here and she had long gray hair. And I just had a question for her. I saw her out here a few months ago. The officer raised an eyebrow and he says, what does she look like? And he says, well, she's short and she has long gray hair past her knees. And the police officer cuts him off and he says, is she wearing layers of old clothing? And he says, yeah. And the officer says, yeah, people out here report seeing her sometimes. And Cade's like, does she live out here? And the officer just says, no. Cade says, well, who is she? You know, like, is she playing pranks on people? And the officer says, I think she's just an old rumor, but if you see her again out here, I don't think you should talk to her. Cade says through the entirety of their conversation, the officer looked extremely uncomfortable. And he hasn't had anything strange happen since and thinks that maybe this was all in his head, but he's still curious. Who was the woman? Was she protecting him? Was she warning him? Was she a stick person herself? I'll be honest, after reading this story, I looked up stick people, and apparently a lot of people from that area and elsewhere report these creatures, these entities, these forest spirits. A lot of the reports are them standing just behind a tree line watching houses. So if you live in the Pacific Northwest, you may want to close your curtains tonight.
Welcome back to another spooky, scary story time. If you like this type of content, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and follow for more. This next story is also about duendes. I have my little mini series going, and I have another story that I want to share with you guys. This story is a little bit long, so you might want to play when you're getting some chores done around the house or something. This is a true story. I'm one to believe things when I see them. So yeah, I can say duendes are real. For those that don't know what duendes are small, mythical creatures that live in nature. Duendes are often known as trolls or elves. There are often mixed options of them. Some say they help with their supernatural abilities, whether it's helping lost children find their way back home, or simply help bring one wealth and prosperity. Some say they're mischievous little pranksters that will lure children and people in the woods, only to never be seen again. Ooh, that got me a little bit scared right now. I was around 5 or 6 when I met him, the duende. I've never had a hyper imagination since my parents never let me have one. I was constantly yelled at to be realistic. I was never allowed to pretend play in the house. My parents never really liked playing games with me or sat down to read to me. I was usually by myself most of the time. I played educational games with my sister at the time, but she was 3 or 2 at that time, so there wasn't much we could play other than tag or make mud pies. My parents were immigrants straight out of Mexico. My dad was a carpenter who would abuse my mom. He made a little over minimum wage, leaving periodically for jobs hundreds of miles away from our small ghetto apartment. My mom, a happy housewife when my dad was away, and miserable when he was home. As a kid, I never knew how depressing my life was back at home. I just thought that was normal. Normal to hear your mom cry and your father's angry words. As a kid, I remember playing by myself often. I did have friends. They were neighbors, but they were often in daycare, so I only got to play with them maybe an hour or 2 every day. But when I would play by myself, I remember talking to someone or something. I don't remember when I started talking to him, but I do remember his voice, high-pitched, almost cartoon-like. But he really was nowhere. He'd always laugh when I'd give up. I don't remember much of my conversations with him. When we talk, it'd always be outside. Sometimes he'd ask if he can come and visit me inside. I always say no because my mom would get mad if I brought friends in the apartment, only to make a mess. But as days or weeks went by, I eventually said yes. He didn't show himself, and he didn't speak when I agreed. Confused, I went back inside. After I said yes, he stopped talking to me. I'd wait for hours and nothing. Eventually, I moved on. I went to start preschool, and a lot of weird things started happening. Every day, I'd wake up with several messy twisted braids in my hair, which made my mom yell at me every morning because they were so difficult to brush out, and it didn't help that my hair was pretty long. My mom figured my younger sister would mess with me and not my hair when I'd fall asleep. I would get yelled at, even hit sometimes, because the SpongeBob TV I had would be on. They'd think I was watching TV all night. Sometimes my things would go missing, my shoes, books, even some of my DVR tapes. My parents' friends, even my younger sister, would feel like something would tug on their feet, causing them to fall down the stairs of the apartment. I would always hear knocking on my window in the middle of the night and find flowers, coins, even bugs on my window still. And one day, I eventually saw him. My mom was getting all of us ready for a birthday party. She asked me to get my dress I was going to wear so she can iron it. And when I walked in my room, I saw 2 little feet sticking out from my bed, as if this thing was trying to hide. Spooking me, I ran to my mom, and there was no explanation as to why 2 little feet would be under my bed. I told her there was someone under my bed, and she ran to my room, only to see there was nothing. My mom yelled at me, thinking I was joking. I started to cry and pleaded to her that I really did see someone under my bed. I described seeing what looked to me like a little boy with knee-high socks and black shoes. My mom asked if it said anything to me, and I said no. Her face was pale from the fear, just like mine. Thinking there was a ghost or a demon, she called a palero, a chaman in Spanish. A day after, and that's when he asked my mom if she had noticed weird things going on. She explained that she had noticed me talking to myself and all the weird things I listed above. He then asked to speak with me. I told him about the voice and how I knew for a fact that the voice was male and how he stopped talking to me when I said he could come inside to visit me. He explained that I was being claimed by a duende and that it had attached itself to me a long time ago when I was a baby, but was attempting to lure me and to take me. He also gave my mom instructions on how to keep him away and leave me alone. And after she did everything he asked her to do, I never saw him again. What do you guys think? This is a little scary. Okay, what do you think? This one freaked me out a little bit. So this thing claimed you as a baby and then just waited for the right opportunity where you could verbally tell it to come in and made it smooth. Like, oh no, honey, I think that was your mistake there, but now y'all got me looking around my backyard. Or even when I'm recording, I'm like, what the fuck? Thinking about these Wendy's. Because then I've been thinking, like, you know how when you place something down and you swear, like, I put it right here, nobody else is home, like, how did it go missing? What if it's these little creatures that are just like y'all told me, everywhere, and we just can't see them, or only special people can see them? Because how does shit just magically disappear in your house? Like, how do things go missing?
Let's read some paranormal stories from Wales. And I got a little Welsh in me, okay, according to my ancestry, if anybody cares. I was 13 years old and lived in a tiny little village, and one day my dog escaped the back garden and went on an adventure by himself. Concerned about him getting into a field with livestock, I went looking for him around the village and remembered there was a patch of woodland up the hill that I'd never been to before. I could imagine the dog would love it there, so I went to check it out. I reached the woods and began to call out the dog's name, hoping he'd come bounding out of the woods, but no sign, so I went further in. I came to a pretty large clearing, and suddenly I felt a little creeped out. I suddenly didn't want to call out for the dog anymore, and thought I should be getting home. I left the clearing and began to hurry back the way I came. Only this time, I could hear something. There were very clear sounds of footsteps in the dry leaves following behind me, and I mean right behind me. As though someone was walking close enough for me to touch them, only there was nothing there. I kept stopping to look around, and the footsteps would quickly stop as well. My skin was crawling, but I had a strong sense that I shouldn't run, so I forced myself to keep walking calmly, but I was completely terrified. I managed to walk about 10 steps with the mysterious sounds keeping pace until my nerve went and broke into a mad run. The worst part is that the moment I ran, I heard a weird high-pitched little giggle coming from behind me. I got the hell out of there and never went back. The dumb dog was waiting for me, having made his way home. I'm glad he didn't go into the woods. He might have been dog-napped by the pixies. As a high school/university student, I worked in a restaurant which was an old Iron Master's mansion. The building itself is around 250 years old, and before it was a restaurant, it was a retirement home complete with a morgue in the always pitch-black attic. I worked there for about 4 years, part-time mostly, but full-time in the summer breaks. There would always be the feeling of never quite being alone, even if it was just me in the restaurant and a lone manager in the office. I would often hear the floorboards creaking above, sounding like people walking over them, to the point where I would go upstairs and investigate. In my peripheral vision, I would often catch the motion of someone turning the corner out of my sight, as if someone was walking away from me. Again, this was to the point where I would walk around the corner to ensure no customers or other staff members were there. The running joke with the staff was that the ghost was called Mary. If anyone reported anything strange, it was just brushed off as Old Mary again. One night, one of the managers organized a psychic evening. The night went as planned, and at the end of the night, the psychic had a little Q&A. The organizing manager asked the psychic, "Do you get any vibes from this place?" The psychic replied that there was an elderly lady rolling around, and her name was not Mary, but Elizabeth. I was working on the bar that night with one of my friends, and the manager hurried over to us in an excited manner and said, "The psychic said the ghost's name is not Mary, but Elizabeth." When he said the name Elizabeth, all of the power went out in the building. The only light was the emergency lighting for the fire exits. We all stood there for about 10 seconds, silently frozen, and then the power came back on. We awkwardly laughed and then carried on. After that, I always ensured I corrected people when they blamed anything strange on Mary to Elizabeth. Wait, that one's like kind of cute. When I was in my early teens, in the 2000s, my mom, stepdad, brother, and I went on holiday to a beautiful cottage in Wales. We liked to explore the area, so we drove around a lot, stopping at abandoned houses on the way, taking some interesting pictures and just enjoying the scenery. One evening, we drove to this small village on the coast, which seemed just like any other out-of-the-way village in Wales. From our arrival, the trip went bad, starting with almost driving off the cliff due to it being completely pitch black. After composing ourselves from our near-death experience, we wandered along the cliff edge where we found a trail leading down to the water. As we started walking down this road, we started to see some abandoned houses, some of which looked like they were almost built into the cliff. On the water side, there was a 3-story building between the road and the water. All of these buildings were very obviously abandoned. As my brother was looking around, he noticed a light switch on in the top floor of the 3-story building to our left. The light stayed on for about 10 to 20 seconds, which really freaked him out, and he insisted that we leave. We tried to calm our nerves and stay to look around for a few more minutes, but all of us started to feel very uneasy. On top of the cliff, probably about a mile or two away, was a huge building which resembled either an old prison or an old-fashioned asylum. Before we left, an alarm from this huge building started blaring in the distance, so we just got the F out of there. As we left the cliff and started driving through the village, a police car appeared behind us, no lights, following our every turn in the pitch black. My brother and I, who were in the back of the car, could not take our eyes off of this police vehicle. It followed us continuously until we reached the sign which said, "Welcome to blank." Neither he or I can remember the name of the town or where this was exactly. After this, the cop car drifted off into the distance and out of view. All of us were very shaken up by this experience, most likely made it worse by it being late at night with very little light pollution. Since this experience, we have tried multiple times to find out where this village is. No matter how hard we look, we cannot find it, which kind of adds to the creepiness. Okay, if you are from Wales, do any of these stories sound familiar? Especially the last one where they find an abandoned hospital and prison or whatever on a cliffside? Let us know in the comments if you know anything about that.
I just read a comment that said, have you ever read or seen a story that has scared you so much you don't want to make a video about it? Or if I made a video and I just never posted it? Yes. So I'm going to talk about it because I saw it today. So basically this woman was talking about how her son has night terrors and very often comes and sleeps in her room. Middle of the night, child is calling for her from the hallway. The door to her room is like cracked open just enough so she can hear him, but she can't see him because the hallway is dark. Calling out to her, saying he had a bad dream, blah 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 blah, like saying he's scared. She's responding to him and is like, hey, like come and sleep with mom, blah 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 blah. He always comes and sleeps in her room. So it's a little unusual that he wanted to like go back and sleep in his room. But as she's talking to her son through the door, she is like, why don't you just come in here? And kept insisting on him coming and sleeping in her bed. The little boy, who's like 5 or 6, is like, no, I want to go sleep in my room. Son is extremely insistent on sleeping in his own bed and is like, please come and help me. Like, I want to go and sleep in my room. She's thinking that maybe he is just outgrowing sleeping with mom in mom's bed. And mind you, he is just getting angrier and more insistent that she comes out to the hallway to come and tuck him in. The moment she caves, she puts her hand down and touches her son, who is sleeping next to her in bed. And the moment she does so, she does not hear anything else in the hallway. So whatever it was trying to lure her out into the hallway in the dark by herself. And that just gives me so much anxiety thinking about that, and that freaks me out so bad because if you've been here a long time, then you know I had a very scary mimic experience about 3 years ago, and I very often think about it because I get mimic emails all the time, and every single one of them is terrifying, just as terrifying as this story. But that's gonna do it for me. Stay tuned for more ghost stories. Thanking my Facebook followers, scary stories. Before I begin, I just want to say that all of these comments come from different videos that I've posted on Facebook, and I will be covering everyone's name because the internet is a weird place. So let's get into it. Was working a night shift as a student nurse, went for a break in an empty room, sat down opposite an empty bed. The mattress sighed quietly and creaked as if someone had sat down on it. 8 out of 10. I would pee my pants. I work as a housekeeper, and actually last week I was sweeping the hallway next to the morgue and I heard a faint, "Hey, come here," sounding like it came from the morgue. And I ran to my boss and he started laughing at me. Mind you, this was at 10 p.m., so nobody was even on the whole west side of that floor. 9.5. Morgue is an absolute no for me. This is already a 10, I'm sorry. Woke up in my great-grandmother's house. I was 6. There was a man in a full suit in the corner with his fingers to his lips saying, "Shh." A voice called my name from an empty closet. I'm gonna say 7.5, 8 out of 10 because I just did a video on something similar to this, and I personally thought that was the most terrifying thing I've ever had to watch in my life. Sleep paralysis. I have personally never had it happen to me, but 11 out of 10. I was babysitting my friend's daughter about 18 years ago. She was sitting on the floor playing with toys when she stopped and looked next to her like someone was sitting with her. She said, "Mr. Lolo, you ain't got no eyeballs." We played in the front yard until her mom came home. 9.5 out of 10. I do not like when kids do weird stuff like that, and it freaks me out. I've talked about how children's imaginations are just so much more expansive than adults, and that is a huge reason why. My first encounter was in a patient's bathroom. I was changing the bathroom trash, just changed the patient. As I turn around to grab the trash, the bathroom sink turns on full blast. The handle was pulled all the way over, and I've never left a room so fast in my life. 6.5, 7 out of 10, because I would have also gotten out of there as fast as I could. And this is the last one I'm going to do for today. My father was assisting on an operation as an orderly. He brought in materials to the doctor and someone said, "Hey, Dave." He asked, "Did you hear that?" And the surgeon said, "Yes, it says your name all the time in here." He quit the next day. I wish I would have gotten the loudest bang I have heard in a while on camera, but I didn't. Here are my closing thoughts. Every time I get an email about a healthcare worker or somebody who hasn't had an experience in a hospital, it is usually nightmare fuel. And I feel like this video did those hospital stories justice, and stories about children and their imaginations. But anyways, that's gonna do it for me. Stay tuned for my ghost stories.
All right, I got a really good one for you, and it creeps me out so bad. It's 1985, and a man named Kit is in bed with his ex-wife, and they are both sleeping. Now, the room wasn't completely dark because there was a street light outside of the bedroom window, and there was a little sliver of light that was kind of coming into the room. It was just enough to make the room faintly visible. He said that their black Pomeranian dog was asleep at the foot of the bed like he always was. So Kit says he had a dream that he woke up in the middle of the night. He said he was looking around the room and everything looked exactly as it did in real life, including that same dull glow from the street light coming in from the window. He said he reached down towards the end of the bed to pet the dog, not even thinking anything of it, just like he normally would. But as soon as his hand got right up next to the dog, it changed. It wasn't a dog anymore. It turned into this glossy black bivalve with kind of like an oyster shell. It was sitting right where the dog was supposed to be. The surface of it was like smooth and shiny, almost wet looking, and then it started to slowly open up. Inside of it were rows of teeth that looked like they were made of glass, almost reflecting that light coming through the window. It was absolutely terrifying. But then all of a sudden, Kit wakes up for real this time. And when he opened his eyes, he saw his wife flailing and kicking and backing up and like struggling to try to back herself away from the foot of the bed. And she was trying to get as far away from the end of the bed as possible, all the while staring straight down to the foot of the bed. And she must have still been asleep because he asked her, "What's wrong?" And guys, she said, "What is that shiny black clam thing with the sharp teeth at the end of the bed? And where's the dog?" And then it hits him. She was seeing that exact same thing he was just seeing in his dream. They both have the same nightmare at the same time with the exact details, and they had never previously said anything like that before. Even now thinking about it gives him chills, as it should. Okay guys, what in the heck is that all about? Like, sure, dreams are dreams, but like, why? Why was it the same? Why was it at the exact same time? And like, why was it that? What a weird and random thing to have lined up so perfectly between the two of them. All right, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you have a creepy story of your own, I need to hear it. And if you are new here, don't forget to follow for more creepy story time.
Let's read another true and scary story from Reddit. My grandfather had one rule growing up in Puerto Rico: never go into the woods after sundown. He said it all the time, but he never explained why. At the time, I assumed it was just one of those old rural superstitions. I didn't realize until I was 14 that he meant it very seriously. I grew up in Fajardo, a beach town on the eastern side of Puerto Rico. Most people think about the ocean when they hear that name. Boats, fishing docks, ferries heading to the smaller islands. But if you actually grow up there, you learn pretty quickly that the ocean isn't the only thing surrounding the town. Behind the neighborhoods and houses, the land turns into thick forest and hills. The woods start just past the last row of houses. Once you get into them, the trees grow close together, the ground becomes uneven, and once the sun goes down, it gets dark in a way that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. I lived with my dad growing up, but my grandparents were our next door neighbors, so I spent a lot of time at their house whenever my dad was working. That meant my grandfather was around almost every day of my life. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to believe in anything supernatural. When he was younger, he had been around 6'3", though by the time I knew him, old age had brought him closer to 6 feet. He was still broad-shouldered and imposing, the kind of man who looked like he had spent his entire life doing hard work. He served in the U.S. Army for about a decade, starting in late 1940s, and after leaving the service, he worked a number of jobs before eventually opening a small bodega in New York during the 1970s. Later, he moved back to Puerto Rico. He wasn't superstitious, which is why the rule always felt strange. Every evening, he would sit on the balcony in a long blue and white hospital chair he had because of circulation problems in his legs. From there, he could see the street and the houses across from us. The woods were behind the houses, out of view. Still, almost every day at some point, he would repeat the same warning: never go into the woods after sundown. He never explained why. One evening when I was about 14, one of my best friends came over. The sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. The sky had that deep orange color that tells you night is coming soon. He asked if we can go explore, and he meant the woods. Normally, I would have asked my grandfather if it was okay, but that time I didn't. I knew what he would say. So instead, I just told him we were going out for a walk. As we were leaving through the gate, he called out to me from the balcony, "Don't go into the woods after sundown." The words caught me off guard. I didn't say anything about the woods. For a moment, I wondered if he somehow knew. I laughed it off and said we wouldn't, but the warning stayed in the back of my mind. We went into the woods anyway. At first, everything felt normal. We followed one of the trails we had walked plenty of times before, The frogs were chirping and the trees moved gently with the evening breeze. Eventually the light faded until moonlight was the only thing lighting the path. After a while, my friend said he needed to take a leak, so he stepped off the trail and walked a little deeper between the trees. I waited. 1 minute passed, then another, then a few more. Something about the woods suddenly felt different. Quieter. Too quiet. So I stepped off the trail and went looking for him. Instead of finding him, I walked straight into a clearing. At first, I thought I recognized it. There was a small open spot in the woods where one of the neighbors had thrown a party once when I was younger. I remembered music, people drinking, a fire pit in the middle. But something about this clearing didn't feel right. The one I remembered was small, maybe 20 feet across at most. This one was much bigger. The tree line stretched farther out than I remembered, forming a wide circle around me. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow walked to a completely different place. But I don't remember there being any other clearings nearby. And standing in the middle of it was a figure. At first, I thought it was my friend, so I called his name. No response. I walked further out of the trees, thinking maybe he just couldn't hear me. By the time I realized something was wrong, I was already deep in the clearing. The figure slowly turned around, and suddenly I realized I was less than 10 feet away. It wasn't my friend. It was an old woman. From the edge of the clearing, she had looked tall, but up close she looked small and frail. Her skin was pale, her hair was white as snow, hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her expression is something I still struggle to describe. The best way I can explain it is this. She looked angry, not normal anger, but something deeper. Something that made her face look almost possessed. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then she lifted her hands. The way she moved them didn't look normal. They moved too fast, too sharply for someone who looked that old. Almost like her body didn't match the way she was moving. She started murmuring something under her breath. I couldn't understand the words. At the same time, the wind suddenly picked up around the clearing. Not a breeze, but a sudden rush of air that pushed through the trees and made the branches bend. Then the temperature dropped. Anyone who has been to Puerto Rico knows how strange that is. Even at night, the air is warm. But suddenly, the cold hit my chest while I breathed. The wind got stronger. The trees around the clearing started swaying, and the entire time she kept moving her hands in the air, murmuring something I couldn't understand. Fear completely took over. I shut my eyes and braced myself for something to happen. But after a few seconds, everything stopped. The wind died instantly, the cold disappeared, the sounds of the forest slowly returned. And when I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. She was gone. It took almost an hour before my friend and I finally found each other again. According to him, he had never moved from the spot where he stepped off the trail. He said 1 minute I was standing there, and the next minute I was gone. We walked out of the woods quickly. The entire time it felt as if something was watching us from between the trees. But the moment we stepped out under the streetlights, that feeling disappeared. When I got home, my grandfather was still on the balcony. At first, he looked angry that I had stayed out so late. But the moment he saw my face, his expression changed. "You're pale. What happened?" he asked. I told him everything. When I finished, he slowly turned and looked toward the dark line of houses that stood between us and the woods. For the first time in my life, that big, tough man looked pale. Finally, he spoke. "Brujas," witches. He immediately went inside and started closing the windows. Every single one. Then he locked the doors. That wasn't something he normally did. Not like that. Before I left for my house next door, I looked back through the doorway. My grandfather was sitting alone in the living room. And for the first time in a long time, I saw him praying the rosary. After that night, we never talked about what happened in the woods again. And he never repeated the rule. He didn't have to. Because from that night on, I understood exactly why he said it. Some places change after the sun goes down. And whatever I saw that night is the reason I will never go into the woods after sundown again. And this story was posted by Material Switch 6199 on r/True Scary Stories. Personally, I don't go into the woods after sundown, but if I did and something like this happened to me, trust I would never be seen in the woods after dark ever again. As always, if you guys have any stories you'd like me to read, please email them to me and I will get to them if I can. I will see you in the next one.
My name is Ariel, and this is a story from my childhood. I've always been fascinated with the paranormal and supernatural. I believed people could experience such things, but I was still a skeptic because up until this night, I had never had an experience of my own, and neither had anyone in my family, at least none that they shared. At the time, I lived in Washington State, shout out to my Washingtonians, in a townhouse with my 2 older brothers and my mom. The entire day started off strange. I woke up and noticed that the charger to my iPad was missing. I asked both of my brothers if they took it, and they told me no. It was a Friday morning during school, so I couldn't do anything about it until I got home that day. The rest of the evening is foggy. I remember searching everywhere for my charger, which had never left my room, but I couldn't find it. No one would let me borrow theirs, so my iPad was slowly dying. I didn't think much of it at first, since I usually only used it before bed, and around 10 p.m., I still had about 40% battery left. What was strange, though, was that I wasn't tired at all, which was unusual for me because I never had trouble falling asleep. But that night, I was still awake at 1 in the morning. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. As my iPad battery drained, my only distraction, my anxiety grew. Around 1:30 a.m., with only 15% left, I decided to force myself to sleep. I pulled the covers over my head and closed my eyes. I fell asleep for a little while until the feeling that someone or something was present in the room suddenly woke me up. I felt like someone was standing behind me. To explain the layout of my room, my bed was against the left wall. The head of the bed faced a large window, and the foot of the bed faced my closet and bedroom door. My dresser was against the right wall. Even though I was still completely under the covers, I had this strange feeling that whatever it was standing in front of my dresser. I stayed still for a moment, trying to calm myself down. Then, without uncovering my face, I reached for my iPad and checked the time. It was 1:45 a.m. I tried to ignore the feeling and go back to sleep, but I couldn't. For peace of mind, I decided to take a quick peek because obviously there was nothing there, right? I lay on my side and opened a small hole in my covers, just big enough for one eye. To my shock and horror, I saw a black shadow figure standing.
I always sleep with the bedroom door closed at night. I don't know what it is, I don't know why, but I always feel more comfortable when the door is closed at night. Now, going back to ancient times, they believed doors not only protected them from humans entering their home, but something negative or evil from coming in. Now, maybe there's something to this. There was a case out in Connecticut. There was this older woman named Ashley. Ashley moves in with a roommate, and it was a small little apartment. She had lived there for about 6 weeks, and she said she was the kind of person that always slept with the door closed at night. But this particular apartment, her bedroom would get really, really warm, and the only way to cool it down was to leave the bedroom door open. So she started sleeping with the doorway open. She said one night she was in bed, and out of the corner of her eye, as she turned in her bed, she looked over at the doorway, and she seen someone walk past. And she kind of rubbed her eyes, and once again, she's seen someone walk past the other way. So the next day, she's talking to her roommate and said, were you walking around last night? I kept seeing you walk by the doorway. And he goes, no, I was asleep in bed the whole night. I didn't get up or anything. So next couple of weeks, this keeps happening. She keeps seeing someone walk by her doorway at night. And then one night it happens, and her roommate is not there. And she actually calls up her roommate. He comes home. He searches the apartment. They don't find anything. So she said then about a couple weeks after that, once again, she was asleep in her bedroom. And she said she woke up and she just felt very, very cold that night. And when she looked over at her door, which was wide open, she said she noticed the doorway was partially closed. It had moved, which was odd because she knew she left the door all the way swung open. And she said that's when she started to hear this scratching sound. And then the sound of footsteps. Boom, 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 walking down the hallway. She said it got right to her doorway, and she started to hear kind of this weird moaning, groaning, kind of raspy sound. And she said she called out to her roommate, hey, is that you? What are you doing? She didn't hear a response. She gets up, she goes over to the doorway, and she looks out. There's no one there. This happens 2 or 3 more times where she hears these footsteps and she could hear this moaning and groaning sound. So finally she said, this must just all be in my head. I'm freaking myself out. I'm going to go back to sleep. So she lays down and she falls asleep. But about an hour later, she wakes up, and when she turns over in the bed and she looks at the doorway, she said there was a woman in this big, tall, brimmed black hat. She didn't have a face, and she was wearing some sort of weird black cloth around her. And she said she tried to scream, but she couldn't move, and it felt like something was holding her down. And whatever it was, she could not move at all. She said that's when all of a sudden the hallway light turned on, and her roommate come down the hallway to use the bathroom. And whatever this was, it was gone. She could move again. She ran out of the bedroom, runs to her roommate, tells him what happened. And the roommate just kind of gives her this strange look. And he says, about 2 years ago, I had the same exact experience. But it's weird. When I started having this thing, I started seeing the same thing as you. I would close my door at night, and it stopped happening. And so she said that for the period of time that she lived at this apartment, she would sleep with the door closed. So what do you think? Does sleeping at night with the door closed keep us safe?
I live here too. I moved in quietly. The door was unlocked, just slightly ajar, like it had been waiting for me. Modern apartments in London are convenient that way. Thin walls, gap behind the units, small maintenance closets, no one bothers to check. I slip through spaces people forget exist.
Oh.
People forget everything when they think they live alone. I've been here a week. 2, maybe. Time doesn't matter when you're never seen. I have a routine. I watch. I learn. I take only what I need, and only at times they aren't around. That's how it stays quiet. That's how it stays safe. I know their patterns already. Morning. The man leaves at 8:17 sharp, phone in hand, headphones clamped over his ears. The woman lingers, lights the kettle, shuffles to the window with her mug, stares at the street. I wait. I count her steps across the living room, the pause at the hallway, the long stretch towards the bathroom. I move then. Always then. I leave a cup on the counter sometimes. Not hers, not his. A little token. They think it's a mistake, maybe a gift from a neighbour, or just their mind playing tricks. I see the furrow of her brow when she notices. She doesn't know. She'll never know. At night, I move differently. Through the hallways, the crawl space, the small maintenance closet behind the fridge. I've learnt how to kneel in the shadows just out of sight. I hear their conversation. Half laughs, snippets of arguments, whispers, the rustle of the sheets. I've even taken to leaving little traces. A shoe slightly shifted. A cushion tilted the wrong way. A chair pulled back a few inches. They notice, of course. They worry. It's always a relief to hear the quiet murmuring, the nervous laughter when they say, "Did you move this?" I watch them sleep. I know when the man snores, when the woman tosses in her dreams, the small gasps, the turn of the head, the stretch of an arm. I adjust myself to the rhythms of the apartment. The heater hums, the radiator clicks, the fridge door pops softly when opened. They are predictable. They're mine to watch. Sometimes I take scraps from the fridge, small things, enough to remind myself I'm here. I'm alive. I'm part of the apartment now. They cannot evict me. They do not see me. The neighbours would never notice. People above, below, beside, they hear nothing unusual. Just the normal creaks, the occasional bump. I'm careful. Every night I remind myself, be careful, don't be seen, do not breathe too loud. They argued last night, though. I heard it through the wall. I swear something's in the apartment, she said. Stop it, you're imagining things, he replied. I almost laughed quietly under the floorboards. Almost. How sweet it is to be suspected but never found. I know the cameras exist. I know where they are. I've touched them once or twice, just slightly, to test their reach. Nothing broke. Nothing recorded. The digital eyes cannot see what they do not expect. They cannot see me. Sometimes I leave little messages. Small scratches along the corner of a floorboard. A mark on the wall behind a cabinet. They think it's aging paint. A fault in the construction. They'll never know that I'm the one who was here. I'm patient. I wait. I'm always waiting. I wait for them to leave, for the perfect moment when the apartment is mine. Sometimes I imagine them gone, imagining the apartment empty. I picture them packing, leaving their little lives behind, never suspecting. And then I smile quietly into the crawl space, because I'm already here, I'm already inside. And now, dear reader, you may be thinking of your own flat, your own walls, your own corners where the light from your lamps don't quite reach, your own floors. You may be picturing me in your apartment, listening as you read this, noting every creak, every breath, every glance at your door. I always have been. I am patient. I wait, and soon, very soon, you might notice me too.
Imagine calling 911 just to tell them that your boyfriend died during a game of hide and seek. And at first, they believe you. But then they do a little bit more investigating and they take your phone. And in your phone, they discover a video that blows this case out of the water. In February of 2020, Florida police got a very strange call from a woman named Sarah Boone. She's screaming in the phone saying that something terrible has just happened. According to Sarah, her and her boyfriend George Torres Jr. were just drinking and having a good time at their apartment together. So naturally, they decided to up their game antics and play hide and seek. And during the game, George had climbed into a suitcase, and Sarah, thinking that it would be funny, said that she zipped it up as a joke. But then, according to her story, she got tired, went upstairs, and went to sleep, leaving George in the suitcase, zipped up. So she said that she forgot all about it, went upstairs, went to sleep, and then when she came downstairs the next morning, she realized that George was still in the suitcase, but he wasn't alive. George had perished in said suitcase. And at first the investigators had no idea what happened. Maybe it was really just an accident. But then the police started looking more into Sarah herself, and that's when they took her phone for the investigation. And what they found would completely change the trajectory of this case. Apparently, there were recorded videos in her phone from the night before, like from the night of the incident. So in these videos, George was trapped in the suitcase. And you can hear him audibly freaking out, struggling to breathe, begging with everything in him to be let out, telling Sarah that he can't breathe, let me out, I can't breathe. But instead of opening the suitcase, Sarah just starts laughing. In one clip of the video, as George is begging for help, Sarah says something that's really chilling. She goes, "This is what it feels like when you hurt me." And then the video abruptly ends. Investigators say that George was left in the suitcase overnight, where he eventually suffocated. So when the videos became part of the court case, that's when this whole thing, took to the internet. People were rightfully outraged and horrified that somebody can just record somebody's final moments like that. And to this day, Sarah has maintained that she had absolutely no intent to let him perish in that suitcase. She said it just started out as a drunken game that just got out of control. And thankfully the investigators were like, yeah, well, that video is kind of damning, Sarah, isn't it? Today this case is often referred to as the suitcase murder because one man's final moments ended in a suitcase, begging for his freedom, begging for air to greet his lungs one last time, and begging for the mercy of his wife. Which I do want to go back and just kind of talk about what she said, saying like, this is how I feel when you hurt me. There is no evidence that he was abusive towards her, at least none that I could find personally, but that is not to say that he was not abusive towards her. I don't really know how I feel about it because usually I will side with the woman because we all know how men can be. But even still, if he was being abusive towards her, there are so many other outlets rather than to trap him in a suitcase until he suffocates to death. Just be careful, okay? Because you never know who's crazy. You never know who's gonna leave you tied up in a suitcase for the things that you've done to them.
On the morning of December 8th, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound, It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal. And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft. And she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. But Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. I mean, basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted, then saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, she wasn't that surprised. She'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. She knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but She knew, behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? I mean, she couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room.
Might have known the story of real-life boogeyman.
She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, he and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway. And then the house was quiet, and she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes, and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Faust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Faust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Faust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car, and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Faust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house. And right away, a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Faust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall. which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. And then the photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately saw what he was talking about. I mean, there was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Faust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Faust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. I mean, it's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Faust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Faust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Faust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Faust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard, and when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Faust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Faust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Faust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Faust very gently asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Faust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, and then after the attack being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house, it's suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Faust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Faust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing, and they were just looking for their mom. But he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand, and as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Faust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Faust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Faust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Faust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Faust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Faust looked at Bradley for his reaction, he saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything. And as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Faust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Faust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Faust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Faust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie. But just then, Faust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Faust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Faust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Faust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Faust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Faust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Faust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day. The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Faust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Faust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Faust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified. And he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Faust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Faust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car was it was heartbreaking. And so Faust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Faust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a black light and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Faust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Faust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag and told Faust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they had come back with a match that really surprised Detective Faust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Faust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So, Faust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Faust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked, and now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Faust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Faust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Faust answered his office phone and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Faust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Faust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbaczewski. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Faust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Faust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Faust was pulled on to other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Faust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Faust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives.
Get ready with me while I tell you guys this ghost story. This story was sent into my email, and if you have any ghost stories, scary stories, or paranormal experiences that you want to share, you can send them to the email in my bio. In 2022, a horror movie about a cursed demonic hand came out in theaters. I just watched this movie. Oh God. One night, my friend and I decided, completely last minute, to go see it. I'm usually not someone who gets scared by horror movies. Demonic movies especially don't really bother me. Girl, why? Those are the ones that I almost always refuse to go watch. But for some reason, this one was different. From the moment the film started, I felt uneasy. The theater we were in was nearly empty, and our seats were right at the very front, directly in front of the screen. Below the screen, there was a short drop-off where the image cut off visually, and on each side were small staircases, with about 5 steps leading down. There was nothing behind them. No hallway, no exit, just the screen. The weather outside was perfectly clear. No storms, no wind, nothing unusual. Everything seemed normal, until one particular scene. During a shower scene in the movie, my friend and I both suddenly noticed something strange near the bottom of the screen. something that wasn't part of the movie. It was a shadow. Listen, this might sound weird, but I already have like this weird relationship with movie theaters. I personally don't like going to the movie theater. The thought of feeling like I am confined to a space for a certain amount of time stresses me out. Unless it's a movie that I like am dying to see, which, to be completely honest, is few and far between. I'm not a huge movie person. I would much rather read. So just the thought of being in the theater and noticing something weird, I don't like that. It looked small, almost like the silhouette of a child. Oh, hell no. Then it slowly moved across the bottom edge of the screen, right where the movie image cuts off. I am about to lose my shit. We both leaned forward, confused. The shape looked like a little girl wearing a medium-length, puffy nightgown, the kind that reminded me of the Annabelle doll dress from The Conjuring. She moved slowly, silently, walking across the bottom of the screen, but she very clearly wasn't part of the movie. She was a shadow. We watched her as she moved, and when she reached the small staircase near the side of the screen, the entire movie froze. The screen flickered, and the projector shut off completely. The theater went completely dark. I am getting up so fast and running. I don't care what I'm falling over. I'm getting out. It stayed that way for several seconds, and eventually the staff restarted the movie. But here's the part that made it even stranger. Girl, I don't think that's possible. This hadn't happened in any other theater, just ours. I immediately felt a wave of dread wash over me. Every instinct in my body told me something was wrong, and I wanted to leave immediately. For the rest of the day, I felt like something was pressing down on me, like an invisible weight was sitting on my chest. And ever since that night, I've seen that shadow figure again. What? Sometimes I see it during sleep paralysis. Sometimes I see it in my dreams. Sometimes it's in the corners of my house, and it's always the same shape, watching, waiting, like it followed me out of that theater.
In honor of Women's History Month, I'm doing 31 Days of Women in Horror. If you're a fan of modern horror, you definitely know Tessa Farmiga. She has become one of the most recognizable faces in modern horror. She first gained attention in 2011's American Horror Story Murder House as Violet Harmon. Her performance as a dark, troubled teen quickly made her a fan favorite. After taking a season off, she returned to American Horror Story's Coven in 2013, this time playing Zoe Benson, a young witch discovering her powers. That same year, she appeared as Anna Green in the psychological thriller Mindscape. Then in 2015, she starred in the horror comedy Final Girls. Then in 2016, she came back to American Horror Story in Roanoke. Then in 2018, she took on one of her biggest roles of her career playing Sister Irene in The Nun, which is part of the Conjuring universe. That same year, she appeared in We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Same year, she returned to American Horror Story Apocalypse, and she revived her character Violet and Zoe Benson. She also appeared in The Mule in 2018, and in 2019's Twilight Zone episode Not All Men. In 2020, she appeared in the horror anthology 50 States of Fright. Then in 2021, she appeared in the thriller John and the Hole. She reappeared as Sister Irene in The Nun 2 in 2023. She continues the role as Sister Irene in The Conjuring Last Rites that appeared last year in 2025. Tessa Farmiga has been one of the defining faces in supernatural horror. Come back tomorrow for my 31 Days of Women in Horror for Women's History Month.